initiated and developed infogap decision theory for modeling and managing severe uncertainty. Infogap theory has impacted the fundamental understanding of uncertainty in human affairs and is applied in decision-making by scholars and practitioners around the world in engineering, biological conservation, economics, project management, climate change, natural hazard response, national security, medicine, and other areas. He's been a visiting scholar in many countries and lectured at universities, technological and medical research institutes, public utilities, and central banks. He's published more than 100 articles, 5 books. He's a professor of mechanical engineering and holds the Atsarkali Chair in Technology and Economics at the Technun, Israel Institute of Technology with a dash. And his new book, he has a new book which has Wonderland in it, which I love. But what's the full title?
Dilemmas of Wonderland.
Dilemmas of Wonderland.
Decisions in the Age of Innovation.
I mean,
yes.
Great title. Let's go.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction. I want to tell you a little bit about infogap theory. And you're welcome to read my book, which has recently been published by Oxford. We're a small group, so if you've got questions, please feel free to ask. If I don't want to answer, I'll just ignore you. So don't take it personally. מה?
הרצאה באנגלית או שזה לא משנה מבחינתך?
Am I supposed to talk in English?
It's up to you.
I can do English, yes.
No, it depends which you prefer.
I think for a website, maybe people is better. What do you say? Okay, it's up to you.
זה קהל יותר גדול.
If it's okay with you guys.
So, English? Okay. So I'm going to tell you about infogap theory, and if you've got questions, please feel free to ask. I will start by telling you what I mean by an innovation dilemma and severe uncertainty, and the concept of optimization and its realization in infogap theory, which is this central idea of robust satisficing. When we get there, I will tell you about robust satisficing and how infogap robust satisficing resolves the dilemma of innovation. And finally, we'll do an example or two, depending on how much time and patience we've got. So that's the menu. Let me start by telling you what I mean by an innovation dilemma. Just the basic idea is you have to choose between two options, where one option is a new technology or something new and innovative. The paradigm here is a new technology, something that's new and innovative, promising, but because it's new, we know less about it, and it has a relatively higher uncertainty. The second option, for which the paradigm is a standard procedure or a standard technology, it's the state of the art. But it's less promising, it's less new, we're more familiar with it, and so it has lower uncertainty. It works, but it may not work as well as the new innovative option. And the dilemma, which option should I choose, derives from the uncertainty. That I would go with the promising innovative option if I weren't rather uncertain about it really working in the conditions of the real world where I plan to use it. That's the innovation dilemma, for which technology is a paradigm, but innovation dilemmas occur in many situations. Here's a technological example: autonomous sensor-based computer control of the car. That's the innovative high-tech technology, and the standard way is you hold onto the steering wheel and you have a foot-operated brake. That's the state of the art. And there are clear advantages to the innovative technology, but the people have only, or not people, robots have driven only, I don't know, 100,000 miles or a few 100,000 miles, and so there's lots of uncertainty. A non-technological example, monetary policy, new tools for new situations. In the recent economic monetary crises, central banks invented, what did they call it, quantitative easing, which is just a euphemism for new tricks that they're trying to apply to get the economy out of the bind that it's in. But Blinder from the Fed is fond of referring to the need for a little stodginess at the central bank, because you can't do experiments with the economy, and new and innovative technologies or techniques are highly uncertain. Should we really use these new ideas when we don't know what they're going to, what impact they will have? Another example, peace or war. Sadat came to Jerusalem in 77, bold diplomatic initiative, definitely an innovation. The state of the art, if we can call it that, was a conventional cycle of war and diplomacy. It turned out for Mr. Sadat that this was a pretty risky initiative, as he learned, and the rest of the world a few years later. A little bit more generically, risk-taking or risk-avoiding. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. That's the innovative approach. Nothing ventured, nothing lost. That's the state of the art. And the dilemma between an innovative option that looks good and the state of the art that works, the dilemma resides in uncertainty. And I'm going to be focusing on how one models and manages deep uncertainty. I will show you methodologically and by example how infogap decision theory models and manages deep uncertainty, and in particular in innovation dilemmas. Yes.
My first question.
Please.
Uncertainty definitely has levels.
Mm-hmm.
Could be high, it could be very slow. But the same choice exists for innovator and one that is not innovator. You can take little risk and settle down for lower level of uncertainty and vice versa. What I'm trying to say is your model sensitive to different levels of each of the extremes?
Right. Yeah.
Can I add to this question, Sim?
Okay.
If there is, if you have a way where you can point how to measure the level of uncertainty.
Well, we'll get to examples, and that question is a little bit early at this point. I would say that there's an important distinction between the risk aversion or risk lovingness of a decision maker. That's one issue which I think you referred to, and the severity of the uncertainty, which is an epistemic state, not a psychological or professional preference. We'll see very clearly the trade-off that the risk lover or risk averse person faces. As far as epistemic uncertainty, I'm talking about situations where you really don't know what the hell's going on. Mm-hmm. And you've got all kinds of PhD students working on it. Another year or two, we'll understand better, but we got to decide now. Mm-hmm. There are many situations, and we'll see some of them, where probability or statistical tools are adequate to dealing with the uncertainty. And when you can do it with the stats, then do it with probability or statistics, and you don't need infogap. So that there are situations which, for various reasons, are systematic enough or well enough understood so that probability and statistics are good decision tools. Then you don't need infogap, and you don't need me. I'm talking about situations where you don't know probability distributions. You don't maybe even know the event space. Those are infogaps, as we'll see in the examples to come. So there's the menu again. I'm going to give you a deeper idea of what I mean by severe or deep uncertainty and the idea of an infogap, both by rather specific examples and more generically by what I will refer to as Shackle-Popper indeterminism. We'll get to that shortly. So the distinction between probabilistic risk and Knightian true uncertainty. This is what I'm going to explain right now. And it's Knightian true uncertainty that infogap is relevant to. And if what one faces is probabilistic risk, then we can stay friends, but you don't need infogap theory. So in probabilistic risk, there are many examples. Drought, you have a stochastic process. Industrial accidents, you have actuarial tables. Tsunami, you have historical data. Faulty air filters, you have quality control data. Deception, scam, you have sociological data. Lots of data, and maybe, and in some cases, there's not an example here, perhaps, you have fundamental understanding, shot noise and electronic noise. You have fundamental models for the stochastic variability. In those situations, The event space is known, it's structured. It may be very complex, but you know the structure of the event space. You can model that event space with probability distributions, and it's manageable. It still might be very risky, but you can use probability theory, and you don't need InfoGap. This gentleman here, Frank Knight, was an economist in the first half of the 20th century, in which days one could smoke a pipe in one's university office. He was at the University of Chicago. Things have improved since then.
Ancient times.
You almost had to smoke a pipe.
Yes, right. So things have improved. And Knight, actually in his PhD thesis, which he subsequently published in 1929 as a book called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, wrote, among other things, the uncertainties which persist, and he's talking about in economic innovations, the uncertainties which persist are uninsurable because there's no objective measure of probability. He's talking about situations where you just don't know what the competition is doing or what tomorrow's public demand will be, or situations like that. There, you don't know the probability distribution. And so you could make it up, you could assume it, normal with a standard deviation of 3, but that's just wishful thinking. A different way of saying a similar idea is this wonderful saying by the physicist John Wheeler. Many years later, he said this in the 60s. We live on an island of knowledge, surrounded by a sea of ignorance. As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance. Being an uncertainty person, that saying is very close to my heart because it pays the rent. But it's related to another idea that I'll mention briefly, that I sometimes refer to as scientific optimism. Modernity is characterized by the belief that tomorrow we will understand more. Tomorrow the scientists will have figured things out and the engineers will have discovered ways of doing it. That's scientific optimism. The flip side of scientific optimism that often escapes us is that today we are vastly ignorant. If tomorrow we're going to learn all kinds of new and wonderful things, today we are ignoramuses. But we're going to have to make decisions today. So that's another way of saying the Knightian uncertainty or the John Wheeler island of knowledge concept. So I'm talking about non-probabilistic true Knightian uncertainty. True uncertainty was Knight's phrase. And true uncertainty can arise in a number of mechanisms. One mechanism is discovery. You can discover America. Wow. And you might even not think it's America. You might think it's the Indies, right? And those people, you're going to call them Indians, which they ain't, but who cares? Or you could discover nuclear fission. And boy, did that make a bang. Or you could discover Martians. Oh, we haven't discovered Martians yet? Well, imagine how surprised we're going to be when we discover Martians. So discovery is one collection of mechanisms which generate Knightian non-probabilistic true uncertainty. Another is invention or innovation. You have material inventions like the printing press, which changed the shape of the globe, made it much smaller. You have conceptual innovations, ecological responsibility, for example. Or you can have social innovations, the French Revolution, the freedom of man, which eventually became the freedom of women too. But that was a different innovation, much later. And then you have surprise, asymmetric uncertainty, for which the prototype is perhaps an ambush. That the ambusher knows where he and the ambushee is. The ambushee only knows where he is. That asymmetric uncertainty is Knightian uncertainty. A more benign example, perhaps, is competitors' innovation, and sometimes a natural catastrophe can be thought of as an asymmetric innovation. God knows that there's going to be a tsunami somewhere, but somewhere doesn't know that yet. The problem from the point of view of managing uncertainty is what's going to be the next discovery, invention, or surprise? We don't know. That's the flip side of scientific optimism. Knightian uncertainty is unstructured. We don't know the event space. So you can't even get started formulating a probability distribution because you don't know It's like rolling a dice, but you don't know how many sides it's got. And it's much more complicated than that. There are no laws. There's an indeterminism to 19, there's an indeterminism to 19 uncertainty. I will talk about that shortly. It's barely manageable, and that's on a good day. So I want to give a few brief examples. One from a book less well known by this gentleman here. That is Charles Dodgson, otherwise known as Lewis Carroll. And that is Miss Alice Little, who was a dear friend of Charles, and he wrote all kinds of stories. And my most recent book is initially motivated. Each chapter starts with a little passage from Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass. Anyway, Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson was also a mathematician, and he wrote a book called Pillow Problems, which is a collection of mathematical riddles. Presumably, if you can't fall asleep at night, you can pass the time by trying to solve these riddles, and maybe they'll put you to sleep. And there are geometrical riddles and algebraic riddles, and even a chapter on probabilistic riddles. The last chapter in transcendental probability is, in the Pillow Problems, is called Transcendental Probability. And if anyone knows what transcendental probability is, I'd be interested to know. In that chapter, there's only one riddle, and this is it. A bag contains two counters, stones, as to which nothing is known except that each is either black or white. Ascertain their colors without taking them out of the bag. Now, at the back of the book, there are solutions, answers and solutions. The answer is one is black and the other is white. That was obvious to all of you. Lewis Carroll proves that by a technique. I'm not going to go through his proof. He cheats in a way that he may not really even have been aware of. I'm not going to elaborate on that, but a different lecture that I could present is the foibles of probability, because his proof is probabilistic. And he makes an error that Keynes was perhaps one of the early people to point out in his treatise on probability. So the uncertainty here is, well, you just don't know. And then what can you do? Well, you could do probability, but that requires cheating. Another more down-to-earth example is climate change. Sustained rise in greenhouse gases causes temperature rise and economic loss. We have wonderful models for temperature change. The transition from change in greenhouse gases, that's the CO2, to temperature change, and then the economic impact of temperature change on GDP. The problem is that the models, these two classes of models here, I don't like this mouse, but okay. These two classes of models are highly uncertain. I'll show you a graph of that shortly. And the data is very controversial. Here is a graph from one of the earlier IPCC reports, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Here are 10 different models, probabilistic models, for one of the central parameters, the climate sensitivity parameter, S. And you can see that these 10 different models, and these are models made by reputable people. One is from Oxford University, the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University, and others are from distinguished places. But you can see that there are tremendous differences. So if I'm the policymaker, what the hell am I supposed to do? I have a huge info gap here. Tremendous non-probabilistic uncertainty. I can't ascribe probabilities to these different models. I can, but on what basis? And none of them are right. The third example, very different, profiling criminals. Profiling is highly advised when you have limited policing resources. By profiling groups that are engaged in crime, you can increase the arrests of criminals that you actually convict in the profiled group. But what also happens is that crime rises in other groups, because by profiling one group, by diverting resources to one group, you divert resources from another group. And so the other group says, well, gee, my probability of getting caught goes down, and so my propensity to commit crime goes up. And since the profiled group is likely to be a minority, that's not a political statement, that's demographic, the vast majority of potential criminals can increase their involvement in crime, and the result is that total crime goes up. So everybody's happy. The criminals are happy because they're committing more crimes, and the police are happy because they're catching more criminals. But something is screwed up here, and the problem is that we don't know the response functions of these two groups, or we know them with tremendous uncertainty. And so the question of how to allocate resources in this profiling in order to prevent everybody from being happy, in particular the criminals, becomes a problem of managing that uncertainty. I had a PhD student who is, well, no, never mind. So what is an info gap? It's a disparity between what one does know and what one needs to know in order to make a responsible decision. There are two elements here: ignorance, uncertainty, and consequence. And it's distinct from probability. The info gap, we'll see info gap models of uncertainty. They have tremendous amounts of uncertainty, but no probability. And in human affairs, info gaps result from a phenomenon that I will refer to as Shackle-Popper indeterminism, which I'm going to tell you about now. The gentleman on the left, G.L.S. Shackle, was a professor of economics and I think also philosophy at University of Liverpool. And the gentleman on the right was Karl Popper, a philosopher of renown at London School of Economics. They independently developed an idea that neither of them called Shackle-Popper indeterminism, of course, but it's quite similar. And the idea is quite simple, actually, and I will explain it to you now. It's based, this indeterminism is based on two prior ideas. The first prior idea is the idea of intelligence. What people know influences how they behave. If you know it's going to rain, you'll take an umbrella. If you know the enemy has chemical weapons, you'll take a gas mask. What you know influences how you behave. The second idea is the idea of discovery, and this is just a matter of definition. What will be discovered tomorrow cannot be known today because it hasn't been discovered yet. If we knew it today, it wouldn't be a discovery tomorrow. That's related to the scientific optimism that I mentioned earlier. These two ideas, intelligence and discovery, combine to this idea of indeterminism that Shackle and Popper developed independently. For Shackle, this was particularly important in his argument against historical determinism, against Marx. So indeterminism is, in the Shackle-Popper context, the idea that tomorrow's behavior cannot be fully modeled or understood today, because part of tomorrow's behavior will be intelligent, in the sense that it'll be influenced by what people know tomorrow. But what they'll know tomorrow will be, in part, discovered tomorrow. And so today we cannot know everything that will be known and that will influence behavior tomorrow. So there's an inherent unknowability, an inherent element of unknowability about tomorrow's behavior in an open learning environment. And this relates, of course, to Shackle's, to Popper's idea of the open universe and so on. But the basic idea is in a world in which we can learn things, in which we are influenced by what we learn, there's going to be an inherent element of indeterminism. And that indeterminism is very much non-probabilistic. We don't even know the event space because it's in part dependent on things that we cannot identify yet. So those are info gaps, unpredictable, non-probabilistic. We still have to try and grapple with them, and that's what I'm going to be telling you about more and more. So the menu, I've told you the innovation dilemma, the idea of severe uncertainty, info gap, Shackle-Popper. Now I'm going to try and start swerving over to decisions. How do we make decisions? And start with the idea of optimization imperative. And then we'll do some examples. So what does it mean to do your best? We need to do our best. Yaakov, if you're not going to do your best, we'll get someone who can. And I'm sure we can get someone better than you. So what does it mean to do your best? And one thing that it can mean is what I will refer and define as outcome optimization. And the other concept of doing your best will be a procedural optimization. I will distinguish between outcome and procedural optimization. This distinction goes back to Herb Simon at least, if not earlier. And I will bring it down to earth, so to speak, thank you, with the idea of robust satisficing, which we will get to shortly. So substantive outcome optimization is the idea that you use your current best knowledge, best understanding to predict the outcomes of available options, and then you choose the option whose outcome is predicted to be best. That presumably is doing your best. It's using your best knowledge to predict outcomes and then choose the outcome that's predicted to be best. And Ya'akov, if you chose an outcome that's predicted to be second best or third best, you've got some explaining to do. And that's what I'm going to be explaining in the next 10 or 15 minutes. That's what I'm referring to as outcome optimization. It is what we usually mean by optimization. Use your best knowledge to predict outcomes and then choose the option that's predicted to be best. Those predictions, by the way, could be stochastic. That's perfectly okay. Your knowledge could be stochastic. You could predict stochastic outcomes and choose the option which is in some probabilistic or statistical measure best. And this is totally useful under Knightian risk, where you have structured uncertainty and you have reliable probabilistic predictions. They might be very complicated, like this picture is meant to hint. So I'm not objecting in principle and universally to outcome optimization, but it depends on one's having models that are pretty good. Those models might be stochastic, that's fine, but they better be pretty good. And if they are pretty good, then you don't need InfoGap and you should do outcome optimization. Otherwise, we'll find someone who can. But outcome optimization is not useful, and I'll even suggest, seriously, that it is irresponsible when you're facing Knightian uncertainty. It is irresponsible to use your best models as though they were pretty true when you're facing Knightian uncertainty, because they're probably not pretty true. So an unstructured Knightian uncertainty with unreliable predictions, you need to do something else, because this thing is not plugged in. So as we home in on what one should do under Knightian uncertainty, let's start with our questions. What do we not know? Now, that's a very difficult question, because if I ask someone what they know, they can tell me. But if I ask them, well, Ya'akov, what do you not know? That's a more difficult question. And it actually is a central question here, and we will grapple with it. More specifically, what I'll refer to as the robustness questions are two. First of all, what is an essential outcome? Stating less politely, what is the worst outcome you could live with? And how robust or immune are we to surprise? We're going to be surprised. We're living in a world, an open universe, Popper's open universe. We're going to get the socks surprised off of us. So how robust are we, or need we be, to surprise? Those are the two central questions for robustness. There's a flip side to uncertainty, and that is that surprises can be favorable. This has never known to happen, but in theory, it's possible. Things could turn out better than possible. And there is a second decision function in InfoGap theory. The first one is the robustness function. The second is the opportuneness function. And that is the analog to the essential outcome question is, what would be a wonderful, wildest dream windfall outcome? Think big, Ya'akov. What is a wonderful outcome that would really be delightful to observe? And how can we exploit unexpected opportunities? We will look briefly at the opportuneness function. Usually we focus in application on robustness because we're risk averse, but we can also focus on opportuneness, and we will see briefly an example later on. And then, of course, how do we prioritize our decision alternatives? And what are the trade-offs? This is part of what Nurit was referring to before. We will see a number of trade-offs. One of the interesting things is whether there is a trade-off or a trade-on between robustness and opportuneness. I will leave that open for the moment. So I'm not going to get into any math, although there will be an equation or two just to show that we have them. But the robustness answer depends on three things. A system model, that is a model of the process that we are concerned with. This could be a mathematical model or a mental model, depending on how much God has graced you. And then there are outcome requirements and uncertainty models, where these uncertainty models are non-probabilistic. Those three things combine in various ways to produce a robustness function that depends on the decision that you are considering, and that robustness function then is used to prioritize your options. You will prefer an option that is more robust over one that is less robust for achieving your critical requirements. The opportunist answer is similar. You have the same system model. Now you have outcome aspirations. They're not critical survival requirements. They're wildest, wonderful dreams. And you have an uncertainty model, generates the opportunist function, and also prioritizes the options. So, okay, that's the menu. And now let's get a little bit further into how we actually evaluate the robustness. I'm not going to really tell you how to do that. If you want to know that, you got to buy my book. But we'll get a taste of it and do some examples. So 2 questions for the decision maker. What are the goals? What are your critical outcomes? What do you really need to achieve? And how much error or surprise can we tolerate? And those are questions that I mentioned earlier. And now the idea of satisficing. Again, the word satisficing was in the Oxford English Dictionary for several hundred years. Well, it was in the English language for several hundred years. And Herb Simon got it a new entry in the Oxford English Dictionary by giving it the meaning of achieving critical requirements, doing good enough, what the engineers would call satisfying design specifications. So satisficing is to achieve a critical outcome, and those critical outcomes could be either modest or ambitious. It might be that the worst you can tolerate is very, very demanding, but we will see that there are important trade-offs when you start demanding very desirable outcomes. So robustness is an immunity to ignorance. It is the greatest tolerable error or surprise up to which you are guaranteed to achieve your critical outcomes. And the concept of robust satisficing is to optimize the robustness and satisfice the goals. And that is a procedural optimization. You're not optimizing the substantive good of the outcome. We're not trying to optimize the outcome. It's not an outcome optimization. The outcome is going to be good enough, not optimal. And we'll even see situations where you will choose a putatively suboptimal option because its robustness is greater. What we're optimizing is the thickness of our skin against surprise. And we're satisfying our critical goals. And there are lots of examples of this in the natural world because you are more likely to survive if you are confident of achieving your critical goal. Okay, so I have, I hope, illuminated the difference between the outcome optimization, which is the idea of using your best knowledge to predict outcomes and then select the option whose predicted outcome is best. That's fine if your models are pretty good. Or this procedural optimization of robust satisficing, where you ask yourself, what is the worst outcome, it could be multidimensional, that I can tolerate, and then I optimize robustness and satisfies those goals. So there's our menu. Let's look at an example or two. This is a schematic example there. If you go to infogap.com, you'll see scores and scores of really big examples. This is a schematic example. Time to recovery after disruption. A building after an earthquake, an energy distribution network after some failure, maybe a cyber failure or who knows what, a microsensor after a shock load, or many other examples that one can imagine of a system that has experienced a severe disruption. And we're going to be talking about disruptions that don't happen very often. I had a project with Intel a number of years ago, and in their production facility in Kiryat Gat, And they never have failures. They have very, very rare failures. And so they know very, very little about the next failure that's going to happen, and it has never happened before. Because anytime a failure occurs, they immediately study the failure, and that failure is never going to happen again. The next failure is going to be a surprise. So that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so the task is to recover critical functions in a specified time. This is a specific example. And the challenges are big info gaps. And I will formulate that a little bit more. We have an innovation dilemma. We have to choose between two design concepts. One is state of the art, sotav, which in Hebrew comes out sounding not so good, but in English, state of the art. Okay, never mind. So option Q equals 0 is the state of the art. And then there's new and innovative, which is the second option. We're going to have to choose between these two in this stylized example. We have a system model. It's the time to recovery, the TTR. And this is a function, T. And it depends on the load, A, which in this stylized example is a number. It's a magnitude of load. But let's think beyond the example. The load might be much more complicated than just the Richter value of the earthquake. It might be its temporal and spatial distribution or whatever. And the TTR, the time to recovery function, depends on the system, whether we're talking about system 0 or system 1, state of the art or new and innovative. And the outcome requirement in this example is that the time to recovery damn well better be less than some critical time. But it would be really wonderful if the time to recovery was less than some wonderful time, which is much shorter than the critical time. So if we're talking about an energy network, we have absolutely got to recover the energy network within 6 hours. But if we could get the energy network back up in an hour, that would be wonderful. You're not going to get fired if you don't do that. It's not a critical survival requirement, but it would be wonderful. And it's an aspiration that I have. Okay, the info gaps here are two. First of all, there's this parameter, the amplitude of the load, and then there's functional uncertainty. And we don't know the shape of this function. T is a function of A. And I'll pause here for a moment because many deep info gaps are in the shape of a function, not the value of a parameter or even the value of a vector. I don't know the shape of a function, of a response function like in the profiling example, or a stress-strain curve under extreme loads. Projects that we've done with Lano, for example, are in that area. Or a functional relationship between an input and output of some new system. I don't know the shape of the function, or I know very little about the shape of the function. It's very difficult to represent uncertainty in the shape of a function probabilistically, but it can be done very naturally in info gap theory. Okay, so in this case, we have estimated TTR functions, and if I can get the mouse, here we go. Okay, so the state of the axis here is the amplitude of the load, and the vertical axis is the putative or estimated time to recovery. So that tilde there means that this is my best guess of the TTR function. And the new and innovative has a putative time to recovery that's better than the state of the art. That's why it's new and innovative. This new and innovative technology purports to recover. I have to keep petting him, otherwise he goes away. That's the thing here, or something. There we go. Okay, so the new and innovative purports to be better because it putatively has shorter time to recovery than the state of the art. Yeah, there we go. But both the value of A and the shape of this function are uncertain. And the info gap is the disparity between what we do know, say a best estimate, historical perhaps, of the load and a best estimate of the TTR function, and what we need to know, which is something, a fairly reliable rendition of those two entities in order to make a responsible decision. So we have known estimated values of A, we have an estimated value of A, but we don't know how wrong that estimate is. We have an unknown fractional error. And let me briefly stress, we don't know a worst case. We don't know, we could guess, we could say, well, it can't be more wrong than a factor of 10. And there's one of two things. Either a factor of 10 is just so preposterously long that it would be useless to use it, or it might be some kind of an educated guess on a worst case, but we don't even know the typical case very well. And so to base our analysis on a worst case would be to base our analysis on that part of our information which we understand least. So worst case analysis is not what we're doing here, and for good reason. And the same for the function. We have some estimate of this time to recovery function, but we just don't know how wrong that function is. And that can be quantified in a particular way. I'm going to skip the math. There are many different mathematical realizations of different types of info gaps. This is one of them. It's non-probabilistic, so there's huge uncertainty, but there's no probability measures here. We're talking about a family of sets of possibilities. These are possible values of A and the function t of A. It's an unbounded family of sets. There's no known worst case. God might know the worst case, but he's deadly quiet now. There are various axioms that I'm not going to go into, just brag by saying that there are axioms. We have axioms. And then we have immunity functions. So the first is the immunity against failure, the robustness function. The robustness of a particular option, and here we're talking about option number Q, which is either state-of-the-art or new and innovative, is the greatest tolerable uncertainty. What is the greatest horizon of uncertainty up to which option Q is guaranteed to satisfy our critical requirement, that is, recovery within T critical hours? The opportunist is also an immunity. It's an immunity against windfall. It is answering a different question. It's answering, in order for an outcome to be better than expected, we need uncertainty. It's like the guy standing at the Western Wall praying to win the lottery, and then the angel comes down and says, well, Shmulik, if you don't buy a ticket, you'll never win the lottery. You need uncertainty in order for things to be better than anticipated. And so the opportunist question is asking, what is the lowest level of uncertainty? What is the minimum horizon of uncertainty up to which a wonderful outcome is possible? That's different from the robustness question, which is asking, what is the greatest horizon of uncertainty up to which we're guaranteed to satisfy our requirement? So these are two complementary decision support functions. And in this simple example, one can calculate the robustness function very easily. And the robustness function looks like this. The horizontal axis is the critical time to survival, at the time to recovery. The time to recovery could be 20 hours or 40 or 60 or whatever. And the vertical axis is the robustness. So we could have a robustness of 1.5, which means we're immune against 150% fractional error, or 100% or 50%. The first thing we note is that, and these are two robustness curves, one for each option. This is the robustness curve for state-of-the-art, and this is the robustness curve for new and innovative. The first thing we note is that these are monotonically increasing functions, and that implies a trade-off. You see, we would like a very demanding outcome is down here. A very demanding outcome is that the time to recovery is very short, but the monotonic increase of the function means that very demanding outcomes have low robustness. The positive slope here means that as you demand better outcomes moving left, you become less robust. And that's sometimes called the pessimist's theorem, because any healthy pessimist knows that more demanding outcomes are more vulnerable to surprise. The important point here is that this is a quantification of that trade-off. It allows the analyst to say, well, how much more vulnerable do I become if I demand a more exacting requirement? It's in the case that one does quantitative analysis, it's a quantitative assessment of the trade-off between the quality of the outcome and the quality of the robustness against surprise. The second thing we note is that both of these robustness curves hit the horizontal axis, that is, reach zero robustness at particular values. And it's not just any old value. The robustness becomes zero precisely at the predicted value for the corresponding option. So the robustness becomes zero for state-of-the-art at a time to recovery of, say, something like 7 hours for state-of-the-art. Well, for state-of-the-art, given our best understanding, that's the predicted time of recovery. The point here is predicted outcomes have zero robustness. Our best model predictions have no robustness against uncertainty in those models that we're using. Now, that sounds trivially obvious, but what it means is that prioritizing one's options based on predicted outcomes is fatuous. Because if we were to prioritize state-of-the-art, to prioritize new and innovative, because its predicted outcome is 3 hours, as opposed to state-of-the-art, whose predicted outcome is 7 hours, we are prioritizing based on predictions that have no robustness to uncertainty. So that's the InfoGap critique of outcome optimization. And the trade-off means that you've got to go start climbing up those robustness curves to choose between these two options. And then the third thing we see in this example is that those robustness curves cross one another. And that means that if our performance requirement is less than, say, about, 15 hours, then we're more robust with new and innovative than with state-of-the-art. If our performance requirement is less than 15 hours, the robust preference is for new and innovative. But the robustness is relatively low. It reaches 50% robustness. That is, we can tolerate 50% error in our uncertain quantities. If we are willing to accept worse outcome, say 20 hours or 40 hours, then we are more robust with state-of-the-art. So we have a preference reversal. And this preference reversal is precisely the resolution of the innovation dilemma. The innovation dilemma between state-of-the-art and new and innovative is that new and innovative is putatively better. Its predicted performance is better than the predicted performance of state-of-the-art. But its uncertainty is greater, and so its trade-off is more severe. And the dilemma is resolved in this robustness, InfoGap robustness analysis by asking the outcome requirement. What is your outcome requirement, Ya'akov? Can you tolerate an outcome requirement of 20 hours? Well, if you can, you're more robust with state-of-the-art. If you require 10 hours, you're more robust with new and innovative. There's your resolution of the innovation crisis, of the innovation dilemma. Now, if a robustness of, say, 10 or 20% is too low, then you might say that neither of those options is adequate. We need to think outside the box, which is always the third option. Okay, briefly, the opportunist function. The opportunist function here, again, the horizontal axis is the wonderful time of recovery. The vertical axis is the opportunist function. And here we see slopes in the opposite direction from the robustness slopes, because more and more wonderful options require greater and greater uncertainty. You have to buy more and more tickets if you want to become more and more sure of possibly winning the lottery. It's a bad analogy, but you get the point. The second thing to note here is that the opportunist function is better for new and innovative, because small is better here. Small is better because it's asking for the new and innovative. Small uncertainties enable the possibility of wonderful outcomes. New and innovative is more opportune than state-of-the-art. And that's useful in particular if you're somewhere near the crossing point. If your requirement is, say, something like 15 or 18 hours, you're pretty ambivalent in terms of between these two options in terms of robustness. You might let opportunists break the tie. Okay, yeah, said all that. Okay. So summarizing this example, and then we'll wrap up. So we have a task, critical recovery of functions in a specified time. We have uncertainty about the load that was applied in this disruptive event and the shape of the response function. We have an innovation dilemma between new and innovative or state-of-the-art design options. We can go with the robustness route, which is asking for the maximum tolerable uncertainty to satisfy our recovery time, or we can look at the opportunist, which is asking for the minimum, what is the lowest amount of uncertainty that enables a wonderfully short recovery time. We saw trade-off, zeroing, and preference reversal. Here's another example. Maybe we'll skip it because we're late on time. Okay, it's a shorter example, very different. Optimal monitoring and surveillance. I have grandchildren and we surveil them. We do surveilling in other circumstances as well. Yes, absolutely. Which turns out to be vigorous exercise. But anyway, what I want to concentrate on in monitoring or surveillance, not with grandchildren so much, is a paradox of learning. And I'll tell you what I mean. Learning is, in this context, discovery of new knowledge. What I mentioned in the context of scientific optimism and Shackle-Popper indeterminism. I'm not talking about learning French or Newtonian physics, things that are known, it's just Ya'akov doesn't know them very well. And now we can talk about optimal learning. And there are 1,000,001 books with optimal learning in their name. And the point of this example is to say that those books are not worth the dust they're collecting. But we'll get to that shortly. So optimal learning can mean you learn in minimal time or with a maximum quantity or with minimal cost or with maximum quality. Those are goals in optimal learning. Optimize your learning of new knowledge. And now to connect this to monitoring or surveillance, we want to learn about a new threat or danger which may be emerging. We don't know about it yet. Where is it emerging and what is it? And it's not, does a mouse live in that crack in this wall? No, we want to learn about something which maybe doesn't even exist. We don't know its essence, or even if it has an essence. Okay, so we need to learn about that in order to discover the threat. And if we are outcome optimizers, we'd like to do that with maximum effectivity. That, again, is a maximizing of something, a substantive good. And there are a range of policy alternatives, and we have, of course, fixed resources. There are only 2 grandparents, for example. And one of them is hiding in his office. Okay, so to be more serious, we can do extensive research. I'm a university professor, and so I'm in favor of that, which means that we would get more knowledge. But then we have less resources for neutralizing because we've used up our resources paying all those professors, which is good. Or we could do less research and have less knowledge, but then we have more resource, time or money or people for neutralizing, which is what we're really supposed to be doing. But we're going to be doing it with less knowledge about this new thing that we don't know if it even exists. So here we have a dilemma. It's related to an innovation dilemma. And one might say, well, let's optimize the amount of research spent on learning about this new threat. Let's try and say maximize the effectivity. Well, in order to optimize the allocation between research and neutralization, you need to know what the threat or danger is. But that's exactly what we don't know because we are learning it. And that's the paradox of optimal learning. Optimal learning is an oxymoron. It's a paradox when I need to be polite. It's an oxymoron when I don't need to be polite. So the resolution is not to try and optimize the effectivity of your neutralization, but satisfies the effectivity. Be effective enough. Decide what is the worst outcome that you could tolerate. If we're talking about WMDs that may exist in terrorist organizations, how bad an outcome can we tolerate? I mean, we're going to have to, if such a thing exists, we're going to have to pay a price. What is the worst price we can pay? Okay. And what we're going to then maximize is not the effectivity, but the robustness against our ignorance. Because we're rich in ignorance, that's exactly why we're going about learning things. And this is a procedural optimization, not a substantive optimization. Well, okay, then the optimizers can come along and say, oh, tush, tush. You could do it adaptively. And absolutely, I'm in favor of adaptive. There are many InfoGap adaptive examples. But if you're going to try and optimize your adaptation, you're going to have to optimize parameters like at what rate do you adjust? And what parameters do you optimize? And you're going to face the same paradox there. You need to satisfy and optimize the robustness of your adaptive algorithm. And the same if you're doing it stochastically. Because if you're going to stochastically optimize a process for which you do not know the probability distribution, then you face an info gap. Okay, so same paradox, and the resolution is to robustly satisfice the learning algorithm. So I hope I've blown optimal learning out of the water. And now, just to wrap up my whole talk, an underlying theme here is the innovation dilemma. We are modernists. We believe in scientific optimism, and it's not a fatuous belief. Things are we're going to know more and have better tools tomorrow, but they're probably going to be new and uncertain, and that creates a dilemma. And that dilemma is fundamental uncertainty. It is unavoidable due to Shackle-Popper indeterminism. And the methodological solution that I proposed is embedded in this theory called infogap decision theory, for which robust satisficing is the primary tool. Opportune windfalling is often a supplementary tool. And I talked about 2 examples. And if there are questions, I'd be glad to try and answer.
I don't have a question, but I now have a lot of homework to do.
Okay.
Very interesting.
As I did not read your book
Yet.
we have to order it for the library. Do you provide any, I'm afraid to use the word empiricist studies in which you used this model?
Yeah. Yes and no. Sometimes the question is, you're being very polite. Sometimes the question is, well, okay, have you tested this against other methods?
Yeah, I try to be polite.
Yeah, yes, I appreciate that. And I thank you for that. I'm going to answer the impolite question. The answer is yes and no. In the practical world, the question is not relevant because you choose your method to match the state of your knowledge.
True.
So that if you have probabilistic knowledge, then, as I said at the very beginning of my talk, you don't need infogap.
Yeah.
Don't bother me. We can be friends. We can have a cup of tea, but you don't need infogap. If your epistemic state is that you don't know probability distributions, or you don't know the tails of the distribution, and it's the tails that are wagging the dog, then you could do Bayesian something or other, for example, but it would just be a guess because you don't know the probability distributions. So, as the Lord High Executioner in The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan said, let the punishment fit the crime and let the method fit one's knowledge. I said yes and no. So another answer is hybridize. There are many, many examples, applications, in which we infogap a probabilistic algorithm. So you can take, say, a Bayesian algorithm, which presumes extensive probabilistic knowledge, both conditional and presumes complete probability distribution, as well as complete utility functions. And we embed that in an infogap robustness analysis, where we robustify ourselves against those elements of the Bayesian analysis which we are not confident of. So infogap hybridizes very well. And there are many hybridized probability infogap applications. So when you're in an infogap situation, I'm not saying don't use probability, but infogap those parts of the probability domain which are deeply uncertain. So the question of which is the true method, that's not the relevant question here. The question is, how do we deal with a particular epistemic state? And you deal with it probabilistically if that's the quality of your knowledge. You deal with it in a hybrid method if you have some probabilistic information, but there are infogaps there. Or in the example I showed with the time to recovery, there was no probability anywhere. And so it was just pure infogap. That would be the answer. But it's a very important question. That would be my answer.
Now, you wrote an interesting proposal using some of this and applying it in emergency risk assessment. Can you talk about that a tiny bit?
Yeah, the thing about the info gaps in emergency situation is that you've practiced one thing, but it's something else that actually
You
happens.
prepare for the emergency that happened before,
Oh.
but not
Yesterday.
yesterday.
right.
But we're not good at
Right.
preparing for what
So-
hasn't happened yet.
Right. So exactly. So that the first contribution of this methodology is in dealing with those aspects of an emergency situation for which one has not prepared, or not prepared completely or adequately, and so on. One, of course, hopes that you will never need infogap. I know if I were the praying type, I would pray for that. But let's be realistic.
Don't worry about this problem.
Yeah, right. Exactly, right. And so that's the first point, that there are infogaps embedded in emergency situations, both when they're natural catastrophes, but even more so when they're even more natural, that is human. Strategic interactions is the polite, sophisticated way of saying it. If he's doing it on purpose, it's not God doing it because he doesn't care. That guy's doing it on purpose, and there's a strategic interaction, and it might be a multi-stage strategic interaction, and you don't know what he knows that you don't know, and so on and so on. So the infogap can be very, very dominant here. And then, of course, the idea of satisficing. This is something that public officials deal with all the time, and they know that there's going to be a cost. And what robust satisficing does is put that recognition front and center. And the robustness function gives the decision maker, sometimes the executive decision maker, not necessarily the analyst in his office, a tool for exploring the trade-offs between the severity of the outcome that he's going to be willing to say, yes, I accept that as a potential, and the amount of confidence he has that it won't be worse than that. That trade-off is irrevocable. That's the positive slope that we saw in the robustness curve, and especially in quantitative models where we're able to quantify that, or in qualitative models where we're able to get a qualitative assessment of that trade-off. That trade-off is of primary importance in policy selection, because the policymaker doesn't give a damn about the uncertainty. What he gives a damn about is outcomes. And that's where he can provide input to this analysis. He can say a time to recovery of 20 hours is totally unacceptable. We've got to have it in 5 hours, or, I'm not going to get elected. Just to pick a random example. So the robust satisficing has an immediate contact with the policy domain. And that's perhaps the second contribution that this methodology has to emergency preparedness.
Can I ask?
Sure.
Regarding the same issue of policy, you criticized earlier the models of climate change. What do you think that infogap has something better to offer in this regard?
Well, in that example, I didn't mean to be criticizing the models per se, and those are probabilistic models, and my accent is an American accent, and Americans are fond of saying some of my best friends are probabilists. But from an infogap point of view, you see those 10 different models, and the policymaker says, okay, now what do I do? So you can infogap that collection of models and say, we don't know what the true model is, but we can ask the robustness question. And then we can prioritize our policies vis-a-vis the robustness to uncertainty in the current state of scientific knowledge. Because the scientists will say, oh, Ya'akov, eventually we will get this all worked out, and Oxford will agree with...
No, they would not, because climate continues to change.
Exactly, even a stronger point. Okay, you're absolutely right. But InfoGap's, in either case, InfoGap is going to say, but we've got to make a decision now. And even though it's going to keep changing, which is definitely true, and that's part of Shackle Popper also, it gives you a tool to deal with the incompleteness of one's knowledge. So I would definitely not throw
and say this is the state that I can satisfy because it's more complicated. It will satisfy me in this case, but not in this case, and the problem became very complicated.
Right. Yeah. The example I showed was you had one entity, the time to recovery, and you've got a time to recovery within a certain time. In the real world, often you have more than one, sometimes a large number, and then the robustness function is not a curve, it's a surface. But it has the same meaning, and its prioritization of options has the same meaning, that when one surface is above another, when the surface of one option, and this is a surface in the multidimensional space of the outcome parameters, time to recovery, number of injuries, cost of recovery, and on and on and on.
Sometimes the synergy makes it.
But the trade-off is more complicated to feel and understand the trade-offs.
Yes, that's true. We can. It's very hard for us to picture a 20-dimensional function. Absolutely. And then one can do slices and projections, and although complexity stays complex, but the principle, the concept remains. And sometimes it even becomes very simple. Sometimes you do have simply robust dominance, that one robustness surface is simply above the robustness surface of all other options, and then you don't need to do any fancy graphics. Option 27 is more robust, it was robust dominance, and we're done on it. Or you identify domains of outcome requirements in which option 27 is more robust than the others. And so there are various ways of unwrapping this, but definitely multidimensional outcome requirements is what happens in the real world. I allowed myself a one-dimensional example because I just wanted to explain the basic idea. Also, another issue is, even in quantitative situations, very often you don't have analytical models. Applications at Los Alamos, they have these huge computers that are run by power stations bigger than the power station of the town, and they do these huge computations so that so that it doesn't presume that you're able to do an analytical example. The example I did here was a simple analytical example, but even when the computation is numerical and requires a fancy computer, the bottom line is you get robustness curves or surfaces that then prioritize options, and you study those robustness curves or surfaces. Somebody's got a question.
An unexpected event. I don't think it's ever never. This was fascinating.
Yeah.
Anybody wants to ask a question?
Yeah, so,
From home.
right. Ya'akov, when are you going to be home?
From YouTube, from the online.
You have more examples in the book?
The book that was mentioned earlier, this Dilemmas of Wonderland, it has no equations in it. It's totally qualitative. It's my 6th book, but it's the first one that has no equations, although it does discuss one of the later chapters. It's a very short book, but one of the later chapters does discuss how you do a qualitative infogap analysis. Earlier books are all quantitative, so the sort of standard textbook is infogap decision theory, full of equations, lots of numerical examples. Infogap economics has also got lots of examples from estimation and forecasting and monetary policy and other areas.
So the Tecnion forgives you for that book.
Well, you know what? I've got tenure.
I know. I know.
As Zubin Mehta said after he got tenure as musical director of the Philharmonic, he said, "Oh, that's wonderful. now I can make as many mistakes as I want. So,
Great. Fascinating.
well, thank you for your
Thank you very
attention.
much.
Wow.
תודה רבה.